G'day athletes, it's Keith here with another episode of the Kilted Athlete podcast. I hope you've all had a great week and have great things planned for the weekend. In this episode, I'll be talking about half marathon training. Now I know that this is a very specific topic, but you can use the same method to scale for like any other type of long run training. So if you're running further than a half marathon, you can scale this up. If you're running less than a half marathon, you can scale it down. So, so don't think just because you're not training for a half marathon, you might be training for another distance. Don't think that this is not relevant because it, as I said, it can be scaled up or down to suit the distance that you're planning. I'm just using the half marathon um, for a couple of reasons. Basically, well, I'm currently training for my first half marathon for the year. That's about, I think 6 or 7 weeks away now. And I do have a couple of friends and listeners of this podcast who are also training for half marathons. And I have mentioned in other podcast episodes that the half marathon is actually my favorite distance to run for several reasons. So let's talk first about what a half marathon is. And I know most of you probably already know, but look, I'll explain anyway. So the half marathon is a half of a standard marathon distance. So your standard marathon is 42.2 kilometers. Your half marathon is 21.1 kilometers. Now I will be speaking in metric in this episode. I will um, briefly explain for those not fluent in metric um, that the half marathon is also, I believe, 13.1 miles. If you need to do any quick conversions into miles, 1 kilometer is 1 mile is 1.6 kilometers. So if you need to if you need to pause the podcast and do a few quick calculations, to if you need to do that for it to make sense to you. Yeah, so running distance 21.1 kilometers. I'm actually not too fond of the word half marathon because 21 kilometers is a pretty solid distance, and to have that insinuation that you've done half of something. Like, there's a lot of I guess smart ass jokes from non-runners here. You wouldn't hear that from a runner, but a non-runner just trying to be a smart ass saying, how come you only did half of it? Where it's a solid distance, the 21k. I think there have been a few pushes to actually change the name of the half marathon along the over the years, but none have really caught on. But anyway, I guess we're stuck with that name. But yeah, the 21k is not. Anyone that can run 21k's hasn't done half or anything. They've put a solid effort in, and utmost respect to people that do this. Anyway, a couple of reasons. I think I've explained this in podcast episodes before, but a couple of reasons the half marathon is my favourite distance. Firstly, you can get over and done with in a couple of hours. So especially if you're traveling somewhere to an event, I usually travel somewhere to do a half marathon. Last year, I traveled to Auckland to do a half marathon, and you kind of still physically capable of enjoying the rest of your day and your holiday. You've got it done, dusted in 2 hours, 2.5 hours, or whatever, or maybe 3 hours, however long it takes. But you can still enjoy enjoy the sights. Go around exploring and do things that you would normally do on a holiday. Whereas if you did a full marathon, you might not feel like going out and exploring and checking out the sights of the new, the place wherever you're going to go on your holiday. So that's one reason I like the half marathon. Um, Another reason is the training time required isn't as intense as a full marathon. So your long runs, in training, um, 2.5 hours for your long run. Whereas if you're training for a marathon, you might be doing a long run of 4 or 5 hours. It's very time consuming. And look, I'm not saying marathon training is bad or anything. Like, if you want to achieve a marathon, once again, full respect. I've done a few marathons, um, and the training is tough for them. Training's tough for any running event because it's scalable to what you're trying to achieve. But yeah, very, very, very time consuming training for the marathon. Um, Whereas your half marathon, it's kind of less time consuming. And the half marathon is achievable for most people. If you've got a baseline of 5 kilometers, you can, not easily, but it's conceivable that within a few months you can actually reach this half marathon mark. There will be a lot of hard work involved. I'm not going to say it's easy, but it's it is achievable. And look, achieving the marathon is, that's achievable too. But the half marathon, especially if you're only at that stage of running 5Ks, the half marathon is actually achievable within a few months of dedicated training. Anyway, so that's some of the reasons the half marathon is my preferred go-to distance. I've done many half marathons over the years. In fact, I've actually lost count. I can count on two hands the number of full marathons I've done, but I've I don't know. I couldn't even guess. There'd be maybe 100 or so. I don't know. I don't know how many half marathons I've done, but um, quite a lot of them. I've done, various like trail half marathons. I've done road half marathons. I even tried to. I made a Guinness World Record attempt a few years ago to to run the fastest half marathon wearing full Scottish Highland attire. Um, if you want to learn more about that, check out episode 2, The Kilt Man, where I talk about how I started running in the kilt. But yeah, that was a bit of fun there. So yeah, I've run many, many, many half marathons. So this training plan I'm going to talk about is well, it's tried and tested. I've done it lots of times. It's it's simple. Like it's not easy, but it's simple. It's actually simple to work out, calculate for yourself. Um, not complicated at all. So, and as I said, you can scale it up or down to whatever distance. So you might be doing a 15K run, so you could scale it down. You might be doing a 30K event, scale it up. It's with a little bit of basic maths, you can come up with your own program. So I'll talk about like a simple my simple training plan, and then other things you may need to consider depending on the particular event that you're training for. So the purpose of of the training for the half marathon is obviously to get you to that distance. So you need to work out what your baseline is at the moment, how far you're regularly running, not how far you ran once, but how far you're regularly running. So, you may have once run 15 kilometers, but that was 6 months ago, but you're only regularly running 8 kilometers. So 8 kilometers would be your baseline. Um, so find that mark, and the what you want to do is like increase distance until you're getting to the 21-kilometer mark at the day of your event. Pretty simple, isn't it? So in conjunction with that, you also want to gradually increase your weekly run distance. So you're trying to increase your single run distance, so your long run distance, and also trying to gradually increase your weekly run distance. And the weekly run distance is something a lot of people don't think about when they factor in the training. They think about how long they go for their long run, but not actually how long they're they're, they're running per week, how much distance per week they're running. And this can bring you unstuck. I if you increase your weekly distance too quickly, this can lead to injury, especially like, kind of as you get older as well. You need to focus a little bit on injury prevention. So and I've made this mistake a few times before, like jumping into too much weekly distance too quickly. So I know there was one time I left the start of the training period a bit too late, and suddenly I had like 4 weeks to train for um for a half marathon, and I ramped up the weekly distance too quickly. So I'd gone from doing like 10 k's a week to like doing 30 k's a week, and then I actually ended up with some plantar fasciitis, which didn't go too well. So yeah, make sure you're gradually increasing that weekly distance, not just suddenly doing a lot more distance. And this kind of works in conjunction with your long run as well. As your long run gets longer, your weekly distance is also going to get longer. And for most people, I would recommend only doing one long run per week for the reasons I outlined just before about too much a weekly distance. If you're suddenly doing two 15K runs per week, then that's made your weekly distance 30 Ks. So it's the overall fatigue of those little muscles around your feet and your calves and knees that are going to, if you ramp it up too quickly, are going to, potentially get injured. So that's why it's important to build into it gradually. Um, firstly your long run and also your overall weekly distance. The two should be kind of work together hand in hand. So before we go any further, let's talk about when to actually begin your training. So ideally, I recommend 12 weeks before the event. It's when you begin your specific training for that event. Now, before that, you should be still running, still be doing some training, just not ramped up at that training intensity. So you still should have a baseline um, of around 8 to 12 kilometers for a long run. Um, but if you're at only at the 5 kilometer mark, it's still achievable. Now, there's a couple of reasons why I like the 12 week. plan. Firstly, because it's a 3 months, it's a solid um, training period without going overtraining, without going too much. So kind of beyond that 12-week period, you you may find yourself overtraining, fatigued from too much training. Um, so yeah, it's I've actually entered a few events that, for reasons out of the organiser's control, has been postponed. So on the day it was meant to be, something's happened, so the event's been postponed, and then it's been on again a month after, or 6 weeks after, or I think one was actually 10 weeks after, and that just blows out that training period, and you find yourself um, kind of like on around that 12-week period, you kind of like at the peak of your training, and then it kind of goes a little bit downhill after that. So I have found that that 12 week period is optimal. And the other thing is, so you kind of want to be, and I'll explain this a bit more later, but at the peak, so you with the 12-week training period, you do your last solid training run um, at the 10-week mark. Um, so you've got 10 weeks of increasing distance. And as you've probably noticed, I'm a big fan of the metric system because everything's divisible by 10. So it's kind of dividing things by 10 makes things easier. So that's just kind of like an added bonus to this 12-week period. The last 2 weeks are what is commonly known as taper period, which I'll talk about um, a bit as well towards the end of the podcast. So anyway, optimally 12 weeks. And this 12-week period, it's sort of like it's generally used by a lot of sports. That's when they kind of ramp up their training for their game, their events, whatever. That 12-week period is commonly used across a lot of athletic, um, I was going to say factions, disciplines, a lot of athletic disciplines. So anyway, 12 weeks out. And so work out what your baseline is, so what you're regularly running, whether that's 5, 7, 8, 10, 12 kilos, kilometers, um, whatever. Work out there and work out, half marathon or whatever distance you're trying to run. So just say you're regularly doing 7 kilometers, you need to get to 21 kilometers. And then work back 2 weeks before the event, as I said, because the last 2 weeks are going to be your taper period, and work out like how much extra you need to add to your long run each week. So let's say my baseline is 7. I need to get to 21. So there's a distance there of 14 kilometers. So that's the gap I need to make up. So essentially what I need to do is add, 1.4 kilometers onto my long run each week. I'm going to round that to 1.5. Doesn't need to be exact. You might round it to, you might want to add 2 kilometers on per week. Up to you. So some people also don't want to actually don't actually want to run the distance of the half marathon until the event. So that's there's nothing wrong with that. If you don't actually want to run the 21 Ks until the day of the event, you just in your training you want to get close to it. So it might be 19, 20 kilometers in your last training run. So last training long run 2 weeks before the event. Um, so whether that's if you don't want to run, the actual 21 Ks until the day of the event, that's fine. Just set that distance at maybe 19, 20 Ks for that last long run before your event. So, as I said, work out how much you need to add on to this to this long run per week. Doesn't need to be exact. Um, and, it's probably mess with your head if it is exact, unless you're a mathematician, if you're trying to add like 1.32 kilometers or something each week, just round it up. Do what, just add a little bit more each week, um, in sort of fairly even increments. So that's your long run. That's and kind of do that on a day where you've got the most time. So for most people that might be a weekend, might be a Saturday or a Sunday. But if you're someone that works weekends, it might be another day that you can do that long run. Like I said, for most people, I would not advise doing more than one long run per week, especially early off in your training program, because that's just going to increase the chance of injury. So for most people, I'd recommend 3 training runs per week. Um, when I say training runs, I mean runs that you're actually trying to you have a specific training target that you're trying to get out of this. Um, if you like to, you can add extra runs, what I call recovery runs, which are kind of little slower runs just to kind of get your feet moving. Um, but you don't want to be doing them at training intensity. So it's 3 main training runs per week. So you've got your long run. As I've explained, you want to get that progressively longer each week. Now your second run, I like to call the 1/3 run, which is essentially a third the distance of your long run. So if your long run for the week is 15 kilometers, your 1/3 run is 5 kilometers. Once again, it doesn't have to be exact. So, if your long run for the week is 16 kilometers, it's going to do my head in trying to figure out a third of 16 kilometers. So, you know, 5, 6, 5.5, whatever, just roughly about a third. Now, you should be doing this at a pace a bit faster than your long run, but not, significantly, not too fast. It still is a fairly, it's like a medium distance run, so you don't want to be going like too fast with this. You're working on the endurance, but because it's about a third of the distance of your long run, you should be able to run considerably faster than you would your long run. But don't stress too much about the speed unless you actually have like a time goal for this. I will briefly touch on my tips for a specific time goal um, towards the end of the episode. So there you have your 1/3 run, um, and you kind of want to time that somewhere during the week where there's a few days difference between your long run. So you're not doing your long run the day after your 1/3 run, or your 1/3 run the day after your long run. You kind of want to space these runs throughout the week evenly, so you have a couple of days break in between. So the third run I want to talk about is some kind of intervals, and this is the one. Intervals, I've done episodes on intervals before. Intervals is kind of the leg day for runners. This is the one where people tend to skip because it's tough. If you're putting in a solid effort, intervals are tough, and the purpose of intervals is basically to make your heart help your heart to be more efficient, um, strengthen your legs, and also strengthen your mindset. Intervals really generate resilience in the mind. Another thing you could do, it's kind of like intervals, but not exactly the same, is negative splits where you do a few splits. Once again, I like to make my splits 1 kilometre, but you do you, where each one is progressively getting faster than the last one. This creates a mindset of finishing strong. So yeah, negative splits is another one I would highly recommend. So you could, 1 week do intervals, another week do negative splits, or hill sprints is another one where you can run up a hill, walk down, run up a hill, walk down. Something tough. So you want you kind of want these sessions to be short but tough. So if you can do that on a day that is you don't have a lot of time. You might be doing these on the treadmill. So treadmills are really good for intervals as well. So treadmills can be boring, especially if you're doing a long run, but they can be really good tools for things like um, speed work, for things like intervals and negative splits. Just to rehash quickly what an interval is, and as I said, I have done specific episodes on intervals, but an interval is a period of running at a really high intensity with a period of running or walking at a lower intensity. So at a higher intensity, your heart rate's up, your you know your muscles are working quite hard, and then there's a period of lower intensity where you're kind of teaching your heart to recover, and then you do several of these. So there's quite a few interval interval plans out there. There's not really any that are great better than others. As long as there's a period of high intensity followed by a period of recovery, done several times. And yeah, look, if you want to know more about intervals, scroll back through my back catalogue. Um, you don't have to overcomplicate these things. There's a lot of plans out there. Once again, it doesn't need to be complicated. You can keep them nice and simple. Once again, do this on the day where you don't have a lot of time. Um, it's because you can get a really solid workout in a short period of time with these type of runs. So with your long run and your 1/3 run gradually increasing, naturally your weekly distance is also going to increase. Just kind of monitor how much distance you're doing overall for the week. So between 30 and 35 kilometers per week is good for a half marathon training plan. You can add a few recovery runs to the week, like I said, um, as long as you don't overdo it. If that weekly distance is jumping too high per week, that's where you're going to um, run into potential injuries. Also, make sure these recovery runs are done at a lower intensity, especially like if you've just done a long run and you've gone out to do a recovery run, but you've gone too fast. You could be setting yourself up for an injury there. So if you are doing recovery runs, make sure they are recovery runs. Don't get caught up running along and then you see your mates running fast, so you feel you need to catch up to them, or you're on a treadmill doing a 1.5K slow run, but there's someone beside you cranking the treadmill up really fast, so you feel you need to catch up to them. Kind of stick with your your plan. So yeah, there are your 3 runs per week. You've got your the long run, which is gradually increasing to mud to the fraction of whatever you worked out. Give or take half a k or whatever. Doesn't have to be precise, but as long as it's gradually increasing up to that 10-week mark, 2 weeks before the event, where you should need to be at your peak, or where you would like to be at your peak. Now, if you started your training plan a bit too late, you might have registered for an event, and you might only have 10 weeks, 9 weeks, whatever. Obviously, you're going to have to like factor in, recalculate. The 12-week plan isn't the be all or end all, but it's one I generally recommend. But that's not saying that if you're only 9 weeks out or 8 weeks out, you can't do the event. You, you obviously have to adjust accordingly. Just use those same principles of not doing too much, not jumping too much too soon, because you don't want to injure yourself. I keep talking about injuring yourself. So the goal of entering a running event is to get to the finish line, obviously, but you can't get to the finish line if you can't get to the start line. So this is why I keep talking about minimizing the risk of injury, because you can't get to the finish line if you can't make it to the start line. So the last thing you want to do is injure yourself 2 weeks before the event and not be able to get to the start line. Anyway, I've digressed again. I'm just rehashing the 3 major training runs. You've got your long run, progressively getting longer until you reach that 10-week peak, or the peak 2 weeks out from the event. You've got your one-third run, roughly a third of what your long run is for the week. And you've got your tough run, your intervals, your negative splits, that kind of stuff that's going to help your heart be more efficient, strengthen your muscles, and also strengthen that mindset, help you be more resilient to finish strong. So pretty simple, hey? But there's a couple other things you may need to factor in. So one of them is the race specific factors. So there may be different things happening in the race. It could be a trail run, there could be mountains involved, it could be beach you're running on, it could be various terrain. It could be a lot hotter than what you're used to. You could be traveling to somewhere that is hotter. You could be traveling somewhere that's colder. So there could be acclimatization factors in there. So you really need to build these into your training. So let's take the trail run, for example. You want to try and replicate what the event's going to be as much as you can in your training. So as much as you can, find some trails to run on. If there's hills involved, find hills to run on. Try to replicate where you can. And sometimes this is difficult because you might live in a suburban kind of area, and there's not many trails around. So in this case, doing some training is better than doing no training. But you do, especially for your longer runs, want to go and try and find somewhere to replicate that. So find somewhere that's got the hill or the trails, or somewhere that's kind of similar, at least once a week, for your long run. And if you need to do your 1/3 run on the road, so be it. But at least once a week, try to replicate the terrain. trail running is a lot different from road running. So there's a lot of different factors involved. There's balance, there's placement of footing. You kind of need to be very alert as to where you're putting your feet and things. Rocks roll, the terrain's all different. It takes a lot of mental alertness, and there's various different things. They're not as straightforward as a road. So you kind of want to get as much. If your event is a trail run, you kind of want to get as much experience running on trails as you can. Another varying factor you need to try and implement into your training is the climate. So if you're training somewhere it's relatively cool and the place where you're racing is going to be a lot warmer, you need to try and factor this into your training. So an example of that is when I lived in Guyra, in the New England area of New South Wales, up in the mountains. It was relatively cool there. Even in summer, it wasn't ridiculously hot. It was relatively cool for training, but I would have a running event in Port Macquarie in March, and even though that was at the end of summer coming into autumn, it was quite hot and muggy and humid. You had 35 degrees Celsius days. Quite hot, quite humid, being on the coast. So this was something that's quite difficult to replicate when you're training, in the New England area of New South Wales, where your days might be 20 degrees and you don't have that humidity. So I used to actually train in the middle of the day up in Guyra to try to closely replicate the conditions that it might be in Port Macquarie. Yeah, so if you are traveling somewhere to a much hotter environment, um, a lot of people like to get up early in the morning and do the training runs, but if your race is going to be in an area that's going to be a lot hotter than what you're used to, then that you're not doing yourself any favours getting up in the cool and training in the cool. You need to try and train to the conditions. Having said that, if you're not used to training in heat, don't go full on and go and get like heat exhaustion or anything like that. Make sure you're acclimatising gradually. Now, I've also mentioned earlier about specific time targets that you might have. So I'm going to use the example of a 2-hour half marathon here, just because it's a nice even figure, nice and easy to work out. If you wanted to do a 2-hour half marathon, you would need to be averaging a pace of 5 minutes 42 per kilometre. So the way to practice this is not on your long run, whereas you're probably all thinking, oh, I'll just set my GPS watch and make sure I'm watching that all the time, that I'm doing 5 minutes 42 per kilometre. I don't find that method very ideal. What I would suggest is on your 1/3 run, or even use intervals for this, you could what are called bracketing. So say for example, if you're doing intervals, and this is where a treadmill comes in very handy for this too, you could set your recovery pace for your intervals at your target pace. So 5 minute 42 per kilometre as the recovery pace on the treadmill. So what you want to do is run faster and then come back to that pace to recover. Um, and that's kind of teaching your heart, your mind to find this pace fairly easy. So when you're going out, when you do your event to run, and you want to run that 2 hour half marathon, you've actually regularly doing that 5 minute 42 pace. So that's generally what I do. Is I set my target pace as my recovery pace for intervals. You can do this on your 1/3 run as well. So you could run, if you're running 5 kilometers, you could run your first kilometer at your recovery pace, then run your second kilometer faster than your recovery pace, and go back to your recovery pace, and just alternate kilometers. Um, and you kind of you you gradually start finding this target pace to be fairly easy. So I found that method works a lot better than trying to watch your GPS watch on during your long run, trying to stick to this particular pace. Now, there's one more thing I want to talk about before we close off here, and that's tapering. Now, people sometimes get the wrong idea about tapering. They kind of think, oh, it's all about putting your feet up and resting. Um, but tapering is more about um, reducing the risk of injury. So there's me again, once again saying reducing the risk of injury, because the last thing you want to be doing is spend 10 weeks training and then a week and a half before your event you do yourself an injury. So you want to reach that peak 2 weeks before the event, and then you go into tapering phase. As I said, tapering is not all about putting your feet up, doing nothing, watching Netflix. It is you're still training, but at a lower intensity. So with tapering, um, I would still maintain my overall weekly distance, but just at a much slower pace. So if my if during my last um, training week I did 30 kilometers throughout the week, I kind of still want to be achieving around that 30 kilometers, just like at a much slower pace, because I don't want to get injured. So I still need to keep the legs turning over. I still need to keep moving. I'm just not training at a high intensity. And once again, as I said, that is about reducing the risk of injury. All right, a couple more things I want to touch on before I close is strength training and nutrition. So strength training, if you've ever listened to any of my podcasts before, I'm big on strength training. A lot of runners avoid it like it's like it. I don't have a good analogy at the moment, but they avoid strength training. Runners don't, generally don't seem to do a lot of it, um, but definitely hit the gym, do weights, lift weights. Um, but what I would suggest, and this is what I do, is I don't really back off on the intensity of my strength training. I just dial down the weights, the amount of weights I actually lift. Um, so overall, I'm lifting about the same in the set, um, but and maybe even lifting more in the set, but not having as much weight on the actual rack. So as an example of that, during non-running training phases, I might be squatting, 100, 110, 120, 130 kilos. Um, but I might be only doing like 4 or 5 reps of that. Um, During my run training periods, I might dial that down to about 80, 70, 80 kilos, but I'm doing more reps. So overall weight, um, I'm probably lifting at least as much, probably even more, but because I don't have that um, really heavy weight on there, it's still heavy enough to be challenging. So I'm not going to dial it down to like 20 kilos, but it's still a challenging weight. But the risk of injury, once again, is not as much, especially if you're running, if you're running 30 kilometers a week, to put 130 kilos across your back into a squat where your tendons are probably quite fatigued from the increased amount of running you're doing. Um, it's probably not such a good idea. So yeah, I dial back the amount of weight I'm lifting for 1 rep, but I tend to do more reps. But once again, still make it a challenging weight. So I'm still lifting, 70, 80, maybe 85 kilos, um, but definitely not going over that 100 kilo mark um, for the squats. Your weight training is important, not just for strength, but also for maintaining muscle mass. If you've increased your load of running, how much running you do, um, chances are you'll drop a lot of weight. But if you're dropping too much weight, a lot of that is going to be muscle mass, and you don't want to be losing muscle mass. Loss of muscle mass is going to affect your mobility, it's going to affect your functionality, it's going to increase your chance of injury. Um, so don't go down that line of trying to, not caring if whether you lose muscle mass, because it is very important that you hang on to that muscle, especially if you're like especially if you're increasing that amount of distance that you're running, because you're obviously going to be using a lot of calories, and your body's going to be wanting to get these calories from somewhere. Obviously, if you're spending a lot more time running, you might need to decrease the number of days that you're lifting weights, but you still want to try and hit every body part twice a week. Um, so don't skip the gym for the purpose of adding more time to running. You want to be hitting these muscle groups twice a week. Um, I have done an episode specifically about weight training for runners, so feel free to go and check that one out. So, and finally, I want to talk about nutrition. Obviously, if as you increase your running load, your energy requirements are going to increase. So try to avoid replacing these energy requirements with empty calories. So what I mean by empty calories is things that are quite calorie dense but don't have much nutritional benefit. I'm talking your chocolates, your lollies and stuff. They're good for a little boost of energy every now and then, but don't go down the track of justifying eating a lot of rubbish because you're running more. Make sure you're getting the nutrients you require. Make sure you're getting protein, fats, carbohydrates. Um, Protein is another one of these stigmas that a lot of runners um, feel they don't need. They tend to think that protein is for bodybuilders, and that just like strength training, they tend to avoid it, justifying eating lots of carbohydrates instead. But if you're not getting enough protein, your body is going to start breaking down its own muscle tissue to to get its protein requirements, which is as I mentioned before, not a good thing because we want to hang on to muscle. So there you go, guys. That's my um, not plan, but recipe, my half marathon training recipe. Um, so instead of me writing out a plan, say this do exactly this thing, this is kind of my recipe for designing your own half marathon training plan. Once again, guys, keep it simple. Be a bit flexible with it too. Obviously, if there might be a certain day that you planned a long run or something, and for some you know, some reason or another, you can't do that long run on that day, mix and match it. And that's a good thing about it instead of, saying, this has to be done on this day, work it around your schedule. Um, yeah, so keep it simple, be flexible, don't do too much too soon. So gradually build into it, in increments. Don't increase your weekly load too much too soon, um, as I can um, I can testify to that. Plantar fasciitis is not fun, and these kind of injuries happen from trying to increase your load too much too soon. Um, Also, take your heat into account. If, as I said, if you're training somewhere that's going to be hotter than where you're normally training, you need to find ways to acclimatise, but don't go too much too soon because you'll end up with a heat injury. So anyway, if you are training out there for a half marathon, good luck to you all. Or if you're training for any other distance running event, good luck. Most of the running events for the year are going to start kicking off in the next month or so. There's about 6 weeks until my first half marathon for the year. March in the southern hemisphere is kind of about when those running events start kicking off. And obviously go throughout the winter, but even March, in many places in Australia is quite hot and humid. Even last year when I did my half marathon in Auckland in April, it was surprisingly I was kind of don't know what I was expecting, but it was a lot more hot and humid than I thought it would be. So yeah, it's kind of even though summer's over in many parts of Australia, it is still quite warm. So anyway, good luck to you all, whatever distance you're running. I know there's a couple of listeners in of this podcast that are doing a half marathon in a couple of months. So yeah, train well, guys, and yeah, hook in and train smart as well. Thanks again for listening, everyone. As usual, if you have any comments, please feel free to pop them in the comments box below. If you have any episode suggestions, questions, or just want to reach out and say good day, feel free to pop something in the comments box below. You can email me at kiltmanfitness@gmail.com, or you can even find me on Facebook and Instagram as the Kilted Athlete Podcast. Thanks, guys. I'll talk to you next time. Bye.